Man by the name of Sisyphus. How'd you like to live with that name, right? Sisyphus was confined to Tartarus for all eternity, the underworld to the Greeks, the part that is punishment. And he was consigned there because he betrayed the gods. And his role in eternity was that he was to push a massive boulder uphill, straining every muscle, sweating and toiling and laboring as he pushed this huge boulder to the top of this hill. And once he got to the top, he'd watch the boulder roll back down again, and he would go back to the bottom of the hill and push it up the hill again. It would roll back down the hill, and he would go to the bottom, push it back up again. That was his plight for all eternity, to push this massive boulder up a hill. Can you imagine that being your punishment? Having to live for all eternity pushing a massive boulder up a hill only to watch it roll back down again, and to continue that over and over again. And yet there are so many people in our world that are doing that every day. They are pushing a rock of despair and disappointment. They're pushing a rock of hopelessness and helplessness, one of guilt from sin. They're consistently and constantly pushing it up a hill. They get to the top of that hill and they watch it roll back down again, and they go to the bottom to start the process all over. You know, when we talk about a new you in the new year, we're talking about turning over a new leaf, or however you want to define it. We're talking about getting rid of that boulder. We're talking about joining God's workforce and understanding that we have a master that is willing to remove that boulder from us. You may remember what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 11, starting in verse 28. He said, "Come to me, all you are weary and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." He said, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy, and my burden is light." You know, the yoke and the burden of the law was not easy, especially what the Pharisees had bound on others because of their hedge laws or their fence laws. These traditions of men that they had created, they were very cumbersome. And Jesus is saying, you can come to me and you don't have to worry about doing all of that. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. As our divine employer, God offers us the best benefits package imaginable. We are well taken care of, not just in this lifetime, but for all eternity. Our wages are peace and comfort and security and hope. I'm reminded of the story of the human resources manager who was interviewing a young applicant. And he asked the young applicant, he says, "How much are you expecting to make?" And the young man says, "I don't know, $100,000 a year." And the human resources manager says, "Well, what would you say to full dental and health insurance, a free car, say a 5 Series BMW? What would you say to to us footing the bill for all of your expenses when you travel?" And he says, "Are you kidding?" And the guy says, "Yeah, but you started it." You know, so often we come with some pretty unrealistic expectations. We might even do that in the Christian realm. But understand, when it comes to our service to God, that we come with all of the benefits, that are afforded to us as we are workers, as servants in the kingdom. Jesus compares the kingdom of God to a benevolent employer who promises potential employees on his team full employment, full-time jobs, and full benefits. Layoffs, recession, hiring freezes, all of these are absent under his leadership. The rewards that God promises are no joke. If you have your Bibles, turn to Matthew chapter 20. The message this evening is really geared toward two groups of people. The first are those who have not joined God's workforce or his household. And the second are those who may have at some point, but need to get rid of the boulder. If you look at Matthew chapter 20, beginning in verse 1, here's what we read. Jesus says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. When he had agreed with the laborers for a denarius for the day, he sent them into his vineyard. And he went out about the third hour, and he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And to those he said, you also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right I will give you. And so they went. Again, he went out about the 6th and the 9th hour, and he did the same thing. And about the 11th hour, he went out and he found others standing around, and he said to them, why have you been standing here idle all day long? They said to him, because no one has hired us. He said to them, you go into the vineyard too. And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last group to the first. When those hired at about the 11th hour came, each one received a denarius. When those hired first came, they thought that they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they grumbled at the landowner, saying, these last men have worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden and the scorching heat of the day. But he answered and said to one of them, friend, I am doing you no wrong. He says, did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what is yours and go. But I wish to give to this last man the same as you. Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with what is my own? Or is your eye envious because I am generous? So the last shall be the first, and the first the last. Now, like with a lot of Jesus' parables, they are aimed at a certain particular group, namely the Jews or the Jewish leaders. And certainly that is the case with this parable here. Jesus, throughout the Gospels, speaks a revolutionary message to all people, but especially to the Jews. I mean, we see many times he is cutting their foundation of their beliefs out from under them many a times. He's certainly dismantling their traditions of men and the things that they were adhering to that were binding on the people that shouldn't be so. And Jesus in this parable is really setting up what he has done at other times in other parables, where he's removing the line of demarcation, this line that exists between the Jews and the Gentiles. This parable is really about the expansion of the kingdom, the broadening of the kingdom. Because with Jesus, that is what's going to happen. The kingdom is going to be broadened. No longer would it just be for the Jews. No longer would they only be God's chosen people. In fact, all who hear the gospel would find acceptance in the kingdom. We see this underlying theme throughout many of Jesus' parables. You take, for instance, the parable of the prodigal son. You know that parable. The son demands his inheritance, which the father gives him. He leaves the father's household. He goes and spends it on loose living. He winds up living in a pigsty and decides that he is going to resolve to return home and go back to the father. And he is received with open arms. The father throws a party, a celebration for him returning home. And that's many times where we stop, and that's the message we get from it, is that God always receives the wayward sinner. And certainly that's not a bad way to look at that parable. That's a good message to receive, but it's more than that. When really, if you look at it, this is a message to the Jewish leaders as well, to say, look, the kingdom is going to be broadened. And how we know that is because of the reaction of the older brother, right? He is representative of the Jews as one who was resentful that the father would throw a party for this wayward son. You remember his reaction? His mentality was anything but celebratory. He didn't like that the son could go and spend all of his inheritance on loose living and then be accepted into the kingdom. But through that parable, again, Jesus is showing the kingdom's going to be broadened. Yes, you've been here all along. Yes, you are my son as well, but you should be happy that more will come into my family, into my household. And so that kind of sets up what we're talking about this evening. Christ came to open the door to the Gentiles, for them to come in, and the Jews were none too happy about it. They didn't like it. And certainly you see that in this parable. You see that some laborers were hired first thing in the morning. Those workers, of course, represent the Jews. The landowner, which is God, chose them first, but the master decided to expand his workforce. And so he goes out at different parts of the day and he hires more workers, including in the 11th hour of the day, which would have been very late in the day. He hires more workers. And then at the end of the day, when it's time to settle up, he pays them all the exact same amount. In other words, the ones who had worked from the first thing in the morning all the way to the end of the day received 1 day's wage, just as those who were hired very late in the day and didn't work near as long also received 1 day's wage. Well, we can almost understand why those who were hired first would be upset, right? And they were. I mean, why are we getting the same amount as they are? Shouldn't we be paid more? And Jesus, in essence, says, why are you worried about it? You're getting what you agreed to work for. It's not your money to begin with. I can do whatever I want with it, right? If I want to hire somebody late in the day and pay them the same amount, I can do that. Do you see this attitude in the church sometimes? Do you see this mentality sometimes within the Lord's church? I've heard people say, Chris, I've been a Christian a long time. Some 50, 60, 70 years. And you're telling me that someone can convert on their deathbed and they're going to get heaven just like I am? That doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem right that someone can come to Christ right before death and they're going to receive the same amount of blessings in eternity than I am. Surely there's degrees of heaven, right? Because surely they wouldn't receive the same amount of blessings that I would. Of course, I always respond by saying, well, are you going to receive the same amount of blessing then as Paul? I mean, have you really done as much as Paul did in his life? We can argue that all day long, but sometimes we see this mentality in the church. We see folks tend to want to get credit because they've been a Christian a long time and think that they have some sort of seniority or superiority over someone who comes to Christ in the last hour, so to speak. I think the message that we get here really can be summed up in what the landowner says in verse 13. He says, friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what is yours and go. But if I wish to give to this last man the same as you, is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with what is my own? In other words, Christ is saying, do your job. Quit worrying about all these other things. Quit worrying about who's first and who gets more. Just do your job. It's what the Patriots head coach says all the time, right? Bill Belichick. A very dry guy, if there ever was a dry person in sports. Very dry, very tame, very docile, but he always says that, just do your job. You've got a job to do, just do your job. And I think that that's the message really that you get here. Is look, you were hired on to do a job. Just do it. Quit worrying about everybody else. Because a servant's mentality doesn't have these kind of thoughts about who should get more and who should get less. You are a servant in the kingdom. You should feel blessed to even be a part. Just do your job. I don't know about you, but I can kind of see why these folks would be angry. You think about it, if you worked all day in the scorching sun and you're getting the same reward as somebody who didn't work near as long, Jesus says the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And the very fact that Jesus came to broaden the kingdom should provide every individual with hope. And that's really the practical message of the parable of the laborers in the vineyard, is that it's never too late. We've seen it. We've seen people baptized in their 70s. And we had a gentleman who was 89 that was baptized in Cassville, Missouri. As long as there is breath in your lungs, as long as you're able to draw a breath, there is hope. Now, I don't believe that Jesus is using this parable as an excuse. I don't believe anyone should say, well, I can convert later in life. I mean, Jesus even said through that parable that I'm going to receive the same amount of blessings, so I can just sow my wild oats while I'm young. I don't believe in any way, shape, and form that's what Jesus is wanting us to take away. I think the practical message is simple, is that as long as we're alive, there is hope. As long as we are drawing a breath, we have the opportunity to come to Christ, to have salvation. Napoleon Bonaparte is considered to be one of the greatest military strategists of all time. He's only about 5'3", but many people said he was worth about 10,000 people in battle. And the reason why is because he was asked one time, what makes you successful? And he says, because I know how to spend 5 minutes. In other words, when other generals were enjoying themselves or maybe relaxing, he was reading, he was studying, he was strategizing to try to come up with a way in order to be better and to win the battle. He knew how to spend 5 minutes. It doesn't take a long time to determine that you're going to live better, that you're going to do better. It doesn't take a long time to understand what it means to become a child of God. It may take longer than 5 minutes, but we need to know how to spend our time wisely, is the point. And Paul writes in Ephesians 5:15, therefore be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time because the days are evil. So how are you going to spend your time? Are you going to make the most of your time? Are you going to spend it pushing a boulder, or are you going to do something more worthwhile? Are you going to do something that is effective, something that is godly? In Acts chapter 8, Philip approaches this Ethiopian eunuch that is sitting in a chariot, and he is studying part of Isaiah. And Philip approaches him and asks him if he understands what he's reading. He says, "How can I unless somebody explains it to me?" And so Philip walked him through, basically preached the gospel to him, taking him from Isaiah, in that chapter in Isaiah 53, and going further. And then they're traveling along, and he notices some water, and he says, "Look, there's water. I mean, what hinders me from being baptized?" And Philip says, "If you believe, nothing." And so they go down in the water, and he is baptized, and he comes out, and he's a child of God, a new creature in Christ. In Philippian jailer in Acts chapter 16, we see, is approached by Paul and Silas. And he says, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" And they told him, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." And they spoke the word of the Lord to him, together with him and his household. And upon hearing these words, he immediately was baptized. This Philippian jailer turned over a new leaf, and he found Jesus. Both the eunuch, both him and the the Philippian jailer made some very wise decisions, the most wise decision they could ever make. They made the most of their time. They saw no reason to put off being baptized. They did it immediately. There was a sense of urgency. In Matthew chapter 9 and verse 9, it reads, "As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting in the tax collector's booth, and he said to him, 'Follow me.' And he got up and he followed him." It's really not a long, drawn-out process. It's really not all that complicated. To make the decision to follow Jesus, to make the decision to become a child of God, is really not something that requires a long and drawn-out process. Certainly, as we've talked about before, it is a process, and it's something that we need to take seriously, and we need to know all the ins and outs of what it means to be a disciple before we enter in. I think Jesus was honest enough to say, before you consider discipleship, consider what it means to be a follower. But to make the decision to become a child of God is really not something that is all that difficult. As long as we're alive, there's an opportunity. I want to ask you this evening, what's holding you back? What's kept you from making that decision? I mean, we see that decision met with urgency over and over again in the Bible. We also see the unfortunate circumstances or conditions when someone delays that decision or puts it off and it's too late. You can look at Luke chapter 16, for instance, and see the rich man and where he ends up, and how he didn't take the advantage of the opportunity that was afforded to him and what it led to. A wise man once said, "The tragedy of life is not that it ends so soon, but that we wait so long to begin it." My guess is that every time we gather here together, there is someone who feels a need to answer the invitation, or maybe doesn't feel the need to necessarily answer the invitation, but knows in their heart that they need to do something different, but they've just never done it. I cannot think of any better way to start the new year than to decide to live righteously, to dedicate your life to God, to make certain that you're right with Him. And whatever it is that's tethering you to the pew and keeping you from coming down the aisle, you cut that cord and you just do it. I don't know why we would put that decision off, but I understand that some feel like in their mind that they have a very plausible reason for doing that. Understand, there is no good excuse to do nothing. Oftentimes when we approach the new year, we put a lot of stock into one day, don't we? The sun sets on December the 31st, and the sun rises on January the 1st, and we consider, that to be a great day. This is going to be a new year for us. We're all excited. We're ready to start anew. It's kind of like if you've ever ordered a piece of exercise equipment. You ever order a weight bench or a Stairmaster or a treadmill? What's your attitude like? Before it even gets there, how do you feel? Before it even comes to your house, how do you feel? Well, you feel healthy, don't you? I mean, you just start to feel it. Before it even gets to your house, you feel like, yeah, I'm going to get this going. I'm I'm good. I already feel better because I'm doing something about it, right? You haven't done anything yet, but your state of mind is better. And we do that with the new year. We approach it with this idea that we're going to be better. We're going to stop smoking, stop drinking. We're going to eat better. Whatever it is, we're going to stop chewing tobacco. Whatever it is, we've got this idea that we're going to be better, that we're going to fix a lot of things. We're going to be more dedicated to God and to His church and all that. And then February rolls around and we realize, even though it's a new year, it's the same old me. And change is difficult. It's not all that easy. Reality sets in that this is hard. And so we kind of just maybe put it off, or we're not as excited anymore. The excitement fades and we kind of fall into the same old habits. I want to encourage you, if you haven't done so already, to write down some New Year's resolutions for this year and post them somewhere in your house, somewhere where you can see them constantly to remind you. And listen, I'm not talking about physical habits. Maybe you do need to do away with some things or add some new habits to your life when it comes to that stuff. I'm talking about being more spiritually fit in the new year. What can I do to be a better Bible student? What can I do to get closer to God? How can I serve the church better? How can I be more evangelistic? And what do I need to do personally? That's where it all starts. What do I need to do personally to be right with God? Unfortunately, some people come to church every Sunday, and they come and they occupy a pew, but God has not occupied their heart. Their heart is beating for other things. They have not fully surrendered. Unfortunately, there are folks that know they need to do something, and they just cannot bring themselves to step out and do it. My friends, I cannot tell you how many people have gone to their grave thinking that way, feeling that way. Don't make that mistake. As we come to a new year, make it a new you. And whatever you've got to do to accomplish that, do it. And it may be something that happens throughout the year, more than likely it will be, but it may be something that needs to happen tonight. Something that you need to take care of right here, right now. Why wait on that? You think about how wonderful we can be as a church family, how much we can accomplish if all of us are on the same page and reading from the same script. But first and foremost, we all need to foster the right relationship. We all need to be making that intimate connection with God. So we want to help you with that. That comes first. So if you have a need,